So, welcome everybody. Welcome back. We're getting to the final presentation of this Saturday. It will be a double one, which is interesting in itself. We had one yesterday and we'll have one tomorrow. It will be Bharatwaj with Susanne, who joined forces, so to speak. They have a very interesting title, as you may have seen before: Heidegger and the Divinities, Ontological, Pluralism, Mysticism, and Devotional Polytheism. So we're all very much looking forward to what's going to happen in the next hour or so.
Thank you, Alfred.
You can start.
Great. All right, I'm going to set a timer here so I don't go over. Okay, so a couple of quotes on the screen there, sort of central to what Bharatwaj and I are working on. Emphasis on several particular things. The decision that Heidegger notes in this quote and many other places is central to our inquiry. So what are you devoted to? And with understanding it is your decision. So our enframing has many of us held captive by screens. We practice a devotion to technology, a kind of tech worship. But we are able to come to presence, let go of willing, cultivate receptive openness, engage in meditative thinking, and thus make possible poiesis as both meaningful making and the making of meaning. We can attend to the gods who are distantly nearing, come to dwell. While being does indeed withdraw, this is not because being retreats into an ineffable beyond, but rather being withdraws in our experience of it due to the fact that it ever exceeds and overflows whatever we get from it, whatever is unconcealed to us. This is being as aletheia, as unconcealment, that always has concealment at its heart. As Heidegger made clear in framing, along with calculative thinking and onto-theological metaphysics, constitute late modernity and thus dominate our paradigm. I had just moments ago came across something great, which was where Heidegger says the worthiness of being to be thought could never be fulfilled through the thinking that is in the metaphysical sense. For Heidegger in his later thinking, metaphysics is synonymous with onto-theology. The later Heidegger's views are well articulated by Iain Thomson. So I'm going to spend a little time talking about a particular essay with reference to maybe one or two others, but Thomson offers a concise formulation of onto-theology in his essay Heideggerian Phenomenology and the Post-Metaphysical Politics of Ontological Pluralism. There he offers the following description: onto-theology's double ground and understanding of being by linking a view of reality's innermost ontological core, its deepest microscopic depth or final component part, with an account of reality's outermost theological expression, its highest ground or ultimate telescopic manifestation. In this way, onto-theologies grasp reality from the outside in and the inside out. A key point made in that essay, however, is that to understand onto-theology is to be led beyond it. I think this is pretty important. To be led beyond onto-theological metaphysics is to recognize and embrace being as ontologically plural. Being is infinite. We humans are finite. We are limited, mortal, always partial in our viewpoint. No matter how much effort we may exert to expand our knowledge, broaden our perspective, attain to more truth, no matter how attached we may be to a particular understanding of truth, even considering it the truth, and no matter how convinced we are of our own rightness, the reality is that it is simply not possible to possess the whole of truth or the whole truth of being. We see that, in fact, there is no such endpoint once we are led beyond onto-theological metaphysics. and thus being is recognized as an inexhaustible source. This recognition enlightens us to the essence of something Heidegger describes when discussing spirit and the spiritual in his essay on poverty. There he says, quote, "The relationship of being to our ownmost, a relationship that is the center, the midpoint that is everywhere, as the midpoint of a circle whose periphery is nowhere." It's a great one. It's worth reading over and over, actually. The boundlessness and the boundarylessness of being are key. Revealed thereby is both the error and futility of onto-theology, as well as the endless wellspring that is ontological pluralism. In terms of clear definitions for ontological pluralism, Thomson offers various formulations in different places. This one is apt. Heidegger's ontological pluralism thus suggests that the meaning of being itself is intrinsically multiple, and that this multiplicity of genuine meanings can never be reduced to a single, all-encompassing understanding. End quote. In that essay, Post-Metaphysical Politics of Ontological Pluralism, Thomson says we must reject the belief that ethics and politics, and I would add religion, spirituality, require us to forgo our finite and partial perspectives. He explains that the very idea that ethics and politics require us to completely abdicate rather than assume the partiality of our finite perspectives is itself a fundamentalism that dangerously assumes itself to stand in as the whole when it is at best only a part of the truth. Ontological pluralism sheds light on our monotonality. It allows us to see more clearly what Heidegger had in mind when he would speak of the one-sided, the one-track, the univocal, etc. It acknowledges the inherently limited nature of our respective perspectives, for no perspective exhausts being. Thus, ontological pluralism soundly rejects all fundamentalisms, any and all claims of a final truth. It requires that we forgo all logics of domination. And of course, as Thomson explains in his essay, resistance to this can be understood as a thanatological impulse, one that fuels our futile attempts to transcend our inherently partial and particular perspective so as to attain some purely objective point of view. It is, in essence, inauthentic being toward death, and it gives birth to the fantasy of some perfect union with universality. An impulse towards such purity, I argue, is necrophiliac. For it is really just an impulse to be dead, to be a non-self, to be not here, to be not Dasein. In a great many of those persons in whom this impulse operates, there is also found an impulse for everyone else to be dead as well. Misery loves company. Thomson says that it is those most righteous purveyors of some one final truth who are themselves lacking a clear conscience, as their efforts are really just efforts to convince themselves, and I would add, to control others. It is their own terror of mortality and death that drives them to repress and deny our common finitude, and such inauthentic being toward death invariably brings on the loss of the holy and desacralization, along with the stripping away of mystery. Likewise, does it prompt them to deny their own innate vulnerability and the ways in which vulnerability unite us with our fellow human beings. It is that vulnerability that is key to releasement, meditative thinking, and dwelling, and many of the things that we're discussing here. Such a delicate vulnerability no doubt presupposes great strength to enact. It is the strength to let go of our willing, to open, to embrace. I do believe this is precisely the Zärtlichkeit, or the tenderness, that Heidegger seeks to emphasize as central to the way of being belonging to the poet, a way of being that he urges us to emulate or to try to cultivate. As Thomson states, we human beings are facets of being, unique and finite perspectives on the historically shifting constellation of intelligibility, a temporally unfolding intelligible order that together we constitute and transform. The freedom or solace or assurance that we all seek by trying to become objective is in fact only attained when we give up that futile quest and simply rest in the acceptance that we are and ever will remain as human beings, limited and partial. Being as such will always overflow and exceed anything it gives us, any meanings we make, and any of our attempts to capture it, for being does not lend itself to a prehensile capture. It is not a totality. It has no boundaries. Boundaries, or the Greek peros, as Heidegger explains to us, are that at which something begins essential unfolding. Thus, boundaries apply to beings, not being. Being is inexhaustible. To understand onto-theological metaphysics is indeed to move beyond it into ontological pluralism and an embrace of the boundlessness of being itself. The later Heidegger's view and vision that Thomson has termed ontological pluralism lets beings be in their uniqueness. At the same time, it allows us to relate to phenomena as that which can only ever be partially understood. Thomson tells us the universal principle of ontological pluralism convincingly underwrites an ethical politics of strong tolerance that is intolerant only of intolerance. Thus, when we let go of our willing, our fruitless ego quest, and we rest open, we may well find that freedom, solace, assurance, peace, or even joy that otherwise elude us. When we learn to love, in Heidegger's sense, to let beings and beings be, to allow the unfolding of essence, and when we make it a daily devotion to safeguard and preserve, we may finally come to dwell in the fourfold with earth, sky, and divinities, and thus build a home for ourselves in our sense of being, as Thomson. When we move beyond our neurotic anxiety and accept that we cannot have a settled and fixed identity, we may finally become, as Iain puts it, ontologically indigenous. So it is in the sense of becoming ontologically indigenous that Bharatwaj and I see a place, perhaps even a need, for what we are provisionally calling devotional polytheism. Of course, the term is itself problematic, given that polytheism as a concept makes sense only in a monotheistic worldview, where poly simply means non-mono. As scholar Jordan Paper notes in his book, The Deities Are Many, polytheism is a monotheistic construct, as polytheists historically had no such term for themselves. Paper also notes, I'll say quickly, that the terms that are used, and he does specifically study Native American tribes and Chinese culture, that the terms that are used in these cultures to signify, what we might be calling the gods or the divinities, is generally a term that's best translated as numinous or power. And they use such terms to reference things like ancestors, spirits, gods, what have you, all of it, but one term is used. It's only after the arrival of monotheism, specifically Christianity, that those terms begin to be translated as God. Paper notes also quickly, from a polytheistic perspective, monotheistic cultures are comparatively limited and uniform. A tradition with a single deity tends toward cultural acknowledgement of a single truth, a single path, a single end, limited approval of personal traits, sometimes a single approved race, and having a number of major ramifications, such as a single esteemed sex or gender. Extreme patriarchy and monotheism are generally found together as a simple fact. Monotheism frequently demands an extreme ethnocentrism, according to paper. Now, thus, for our purposes, we are using this term, devotional polytheism, but keep those things in mind. So we're using the term loosely, and should be understood as merely pointing towards something that still remains largely unthought, as Heidegger would say. I'm very much interested in the unthought. I just think it's fruitful. And so given the grave danger, as Heidegger notes, that calculative thinking may someday come to be accepted and practiced as the only way of thinking, the only appropriate response, as I've noted before, is to, quote, pit meditative thinking decisively against merely calculative thinking. Heidegger tells us that dwelling is the manner in which humans are of the earth. This essential character of human being has been obscured by an inframed and inframing narrative that is errant, oppressive, destructive, and devastating in Heidegger's sense of those terms. Dwelling requires that one has escaped inframing via releasement. Thus does Heidegger say, releasement toward things and openness to the mystery belong together. They grant us the possibility of dwelling in the world in a totally different way. This is only possible when we understand and thus are led beyond onto-theological metaphysics and embrace ontological pluralism, the mystery of being, and thus become a devotee of being and all its divine forms. So how then are we understanding devotional polytheism? Sort of a tentative sketch. It is an approach to the gods that is lived. It is a comportment or a way of being in the world. It is not an aim with an objective. Ultimately, it is not merely a concept to be grasped intellectually. It is not a set of conditions that, when enacted, achieve a result. Rather, it is something that occurs organically, spontaneously, when an individual has realized a kind of opening in their own being. It is phenomenological, and it is not creedal. It is an approach to the divinities that maintains their otherness and feels both their distance and their nearness. In keeping with ontological pluralism, it is an approach where the plurality and multiplicity of the divinities is understood, appreciated, and celebrated. That reminds me where Heidegger notes that the multiplicity of gods is not subject to enumeration. Devotional polytheism thus is a lived devotional comportment toward existence, life, being. And while one may see devotional polytheism as a response to the process of desacralization, destruction, and devastation that are part of inframing, it is also a way of being that is appropriate to releasement itself. And I would say it's a natural outgrowth of the opening that releasement creates. Such an opening or clearing makes possible ereigness. It makes possible the event that is the encounter with being as such and being as the divine. Benjamin Crow describes divinities as sources of interruption and derangement of the normal course of human experience. And I think that's pretty apt. Such an interruptive quality of the divine is in marked contrast to gods that are inframed, gods that have been reduced to resources to be used, objects to be investigated and studied, archetypes to be recognized. In framing forces everyone and everything to assume its place in the domain of the orderable, as Heidegger puts it. Devotional polytheism and the ontological pluralism from which it emerges sees such ordering evaporate. Devotional polytheism restores to complementarity the opposites that onto-theological metaphysics and monotheism have rendered as merely antagonistic. That's pretty important as well. Our late modern worldview and paradigm is one in which the gods are just metaphors and symbols, religious ideas to be enjoyed, or ideas to be wielded as tools of domination and oppression. In framing, reduces the gods to mere idols and props up idols as gods. It renders the divine as empty myth, mere allegory, fable, story, or fairy tale. And Heidegger was indeed critical of readings that reduce mythos to allegory, for he sees it as similar to poetry in that it can disclose new worlds. Our framing reduces the divine to slogans, buzzwords, bumper stickers, catchphrases, and pages you may like. Even paganism is not immune. Anyone may choose to adopt the moniker of witch simply to delegitimize a fashion aesthetic or a taste in decor. Easily observed in recent decades is the rise of what I call witch kitsch and its ever so profitable commodification. Our enframing disconnects us from the divine, from others, from ourself, and from being. When everything has been desacralized, the empty assignation of the term sacred can then be applied to whatever is useful or profitable. Heidegger says, the loss of the gods does not mean the mere elimination of the gods, crude atheism. The loss of the gods is the condition of indecision about gods and God. But loss of the gods is far from excluding religiosity. Rather, it is on its account that the relation to the gods is transformed into religious experience. When this happens, the gods have fled. For us to dwell is to recognize that the divinities of the fourfold are not at our beck and call, at our disposal. And this is what their absence shows us. It is not that the divinities do not exist, that there are no divinities. Rather, it points to the fact that, as Benjamin Crow puts it, the gods are not to be found in our ever-growing stockpile. Thus, each of us is called upon to safeguard at least some of our own individual solitariness and uniqueness, so as to remain ever an individual with an inherently partial perspective, recognizing the perspective as a truth and not the truth. And this will endow us with keen vision to recognize and resist any and all claims that purport to be the truth of the whole. It opens us to what is nearest to us, to the divinities, so that we may, as Heidegger quotes Herlin, feel them and mirror their glory. To give up our own unique and partial perspective so as to simply be in agreement with others, whether in an attempt to avoid being alone, to avoid facing oneself, or to avoid facing mortality, is a spiritual suicide. While there is still a great deal to talk about here, such as mysticism, the relationship between the poet and the mystic, how we incorporate that, I'm going to go ahead and leave some of that there to Bharatwaj and just wrap up with a couple of quotes. The first one from Iain and then something brief from Bharatwaj. in one of his essays. Iain says, direct our attention is what we must do to that nexus of onto-theological prejudgments that negatively impact our understanding and treatment of almost all entities, pervasively distorting our thinking about identities and differences at the deepest and most general levels. Bharatwaj, having taken to heart many of these insights, writes that in order to be true to ontological pluralism, we must endeavor to think plurally about pluralism. All right. Thank you. I hope that was relatively clear.
Thank you so much, Susan. That's so wonderful, and you're so kind. And I wish to begin with a thank you for not just the presentation, but then also the conversations that we've been having, and also you introducing me to that ontological pluralism essay from Thomson in your 2022 conference presentation, which helped me immensely. I looked at Heidegger and Sufism through ontological pluralism, that essay, and thank you for that quotation from there. I'm so grateful. Yes, so what I'll be doing is I'll be speaking for about 20 minutes, and then I have two questions that I want to ask Susanne about the presentation and about devotional polytheism and its relevance in studying Heidegger. So that's I want to ask two questions about that: the importance of the concept, and then I'll maybe open up to the audience to for their questions and their discussions. I'm going to talk about how the concept of both ontological pluralism and devotional polytheism helps us to understand the figure of the mystic in Heidegger, and also touch upon the relationship between the poet and the mystic. And we have been discussing that quite a bit as well. And I also think that this approach to Heidegger and the Divinities has an importance not only in understanding mysticism in Heidegger, but also in opening up questions about the relationship between the East and the West. So my work mainly is Heidegger and mysticism, but Heidegger and Sufi mysticism. So I think that there is a lot of resonance here, which we hope to develop further. So I have a few passages from the mystic that I'm looking at. Ibn Arabi. Susanne also mentioned Ibn Arabi in a response to a question. And the quote that Susanne referred to is also from a paper of mine on Heidegger and Ibn Arabi. So Ibn Arabi is the mystic that I look at. So I'll be showing a few of these interesting passages, and then I have a few passages from Heidegger, and then the questions to Susanne. So I begin with a quotation from Iain Thomson's book, Heidegger, Art and Postmodernity, where he says that Heidegger's post-Christian last God is a phenomenologized and secularized rethinking of Meister Eckhart's Godhead. That is a finally unnameable source of all our different conceptions of God. And as with Thomson's work, I more and more realize that it's in the parentheses and the footnotes that the important, amazing stuff resides. So if you look at the parentheses, this is really a central concept here, so that the Godhead is this ultimately unnameable source of all our different sort of names for the for the divinities. And I think that this insight is shared by a mystic like Ibn Arabi. So this is my first. So the question about the poet and the mystic. So Ibn Arabi was also a poet, and this is from a text of his called Tarjuman al-Ashwaq, which is the translation or translator of desires, where he says that my heart can take on any form. For gazelles, a meadow, a cloister for monks, a temple for idols, the pilgrim's Kaaba, tablets of Torah, scrolls of the Quran. And he says, I profess the religion of love, Din al-Hub. Wherever its camels turn, there lives my faith. So this is a very interesting, poetic testimony of his own sort of pluralistic vision. But what is really important here, and it's something also that Susanne's presentation makes really clear, is that it's not as if Ibn Arabi is talking in a poetic poetic way, and therefore he is in a good mood, as it were. It's really the pluralism comes from the understanding of being. So the way that Ibn Arabi understands being or wujud in Arabic is what leads to a pluralistic, an ontologically pluralistic understanding of religious phenomena, of the other, and the various conceptualizations of God and of faith. This is another text from Ibn Arabi, where he says that he who is more perfect than the perfect is he who believes every belief concerning him. He recognizes him in faith, in proofs, and in heresy. And again, Ibn Arabi is making an ontological point. He says that, as I will show in a few of the passages that are to come, that the divine cannot be known on its own, but only in the various manifestations that the divine can make. In fact, in Arabic, the term for doctrine is aqidah. And Ibn Arabi plays with the word aqidah quite a bit, where he shows how the word aqidah goes back to the term aqd, which means to knot something. And for Ibn Arabi, a creedal position, a belief system, or a comportment to the world is a knotting of this infinite, unknotable, divine, inexhaustible being. So, and then Ibn Arabi, as I said, he has a certain ontological reason for his ontological pluralism. He says that the root of the diversity of beliefs in the cosmos is this manyness in the one entity. So God is simultaneously one and many. And that's what accounts for the diversity that we see around us, according to Ibn Arabi. And this next quotation is from one of the most important of texts by Ibn Arabi. It's called the Fusus al-Hikam. And here, Ibn Arabi focuses on limitation or finitude. In Arabic, this is taqid, to limit something or to delimit something. And every time I read this, I'm reminded of a phrase in that Thomson essay on ontological pluralism, which is the facetiousness of being. That being is encountered in facets. So here Ibn Arabi is saying about God, in fact, about the Godhead, because he also does not use the word God. He uses the word the real, al-haq, to describe this more ultimate Godhead figure. Here he's saying that he is the essence of all things, and all things are limited. To be a thing is to be a limited thing. To be a being is to be limited. Even if their limitations are different, he is limited by the limitation of every limited thing, he says. A thing is limited only by the limitation of the real. So the real limits, and this limitation of the real is why beings and all their limitations exist, and can be made intelligible, according to Ibn Arabi. Now, this is from an Ibn Arabi scholar, Iain, who sort of summarizes Ibn Arabi's sort of approach to being, which is through this notion of bewilderment, which in Arabic is hayra, and in Urdu it's hairat, which is bewilderment is this non-finality of one's approach to the truth. And here he says, bewilderment becomes the best way the believer has of escaping the metaphysical trap of his own perspectiveness. Not in this case by the proffering of some extra linguistic knowledge, but rather by presenting and confusing the believer. So the Sufis also tend to use confusion as an epistemological method to not allow us to be complacent in our metaphysical trappings. So, but rather by presenting and confusing the believer with a multiplicity of different gods, some orthodox, some heretical, some intimately immanent, others aloof and transcendental. And finally, there's this quotation from two really interesting Ibn Arabi scholars in their paper Ibn Arabi and the Kaleidoscope of Being, where basically they're repeating what Ibn Arabi is himself saying, but they say that the true sage appreciates each belief, philosophy, and religion as simultaneously God and not God. Right, knowing the perfection and limitation of all possible perspectives on reality. So that's the sort of pluralism which is ontologically determined in the sense that it is based on Ibn Arabi's understanding of being, and which also allows for this multiplicity of conceptions of God, multiplicity of faith commitments, and multiple ways in which we can encounter and be claimed by the divinity. So there's a lot of connection here with what Susan and I are calling devotional polytheism, connecting it with ontological pluralism, but then also bringing in the mystics who are on the same path, on a similar path. So there's a lot to do here, and yeah. So I was thinking I have a few more things to say before I get to the questions. So okay, so I can stop the sharing. Those were the sort of Ibn Arabi quotes that I wanted to share. Now I have a few things to say. So I wish to quote again from Iain Thomson's text, Heidegger, Art and Postmodernity, where the term polytheistic appears as a description of Heidegger's phenomenological redescription of the gods. He states, and it's in the same place where I quoted from about Eckhart's Godhead. So this is page number 36, 37. So this is 37. So he states that, and I quote, Heidegger thinks it is the mistake to try to quantify the divine because he associates our obsession with quantification, which ends up replacing quality with quantity, with the very nihilistic technological onto-theology that he hopes to help us transcend, end quote. As Susanne has detailed in her presentation, such a technological approach to the divinities makes them subject to our various whims, requirements, and fancies, turning them in the worst case to mere kitsch. I really love that term and that use, and it's so great that Heidegger also uses it. So that's interesting. Okay, so a proper attunement to the divinities, on the other hand, allows us to encounter them in all their otherness, and therefore keeps us exposed to the new possibilities that they threaten. Right? In other words, or in other ways of speaking, such an approach to the divinities allows us to maintain our vulnerability. And Susanne and I had a long, wonderful conversation on vulnerability, and I'm thinking we're going to talk more and more about vulnerability. So, so this approach to the divinities allows us to maintain our vulnerability, our openness to the danger in a good sense, danger of fresh encounter and fresh possibilities. The P-O-L-Y, poly, in our approach to the polytheistic, has the significance not only of an enumerated many, though that too is the case, but with the non-fixity and non-finitude of possibilities of our various ways of being and knowing, and comporting in the world and with others. The account of the gods, or to use the better term, and the one that Susanne also prefers more, divinities. So the account of the divinities raises for us questions about possibility. The relation between being and possibility is a very deep one. Heidegger states in the letter on humanism, and I quote him, "When I speak of the quiet force of the possible, I do not mean the possible of a merely represented possibilitas, nor potentia as the essentia of an actus of existentia." So he's not talking about metaphysical possibility, basically. Rather, I mean being itself, which in its favoring presides over thinking and hence over the essence of humanity. And when Susanne mentions and this is also a question I wanted to ask her at the end, but when Susanne mentions Benjamin Crove's notion of the divinities as interruption, I think what she has in mind is this interruption of other possibilities, right? Other possibilities of comporting in the world, other possibilities of approaching reality. So this favor of being, from Heidegger's letter on humanism, this favor of being is the giving of a ground of a world. And this goes back to, though I don't have the time to develop here, but this goes back to the notion of onto-theology, metaphysics as onto-theology, and how there is a ground giving that metaphysics does, but it's not a permanent foundational ground, but it's only an Ungrund, from Thomson's 2005 work, but where he quotes the introduction to metaphysics, Heidegger's 1935 lecture, where metaphysics, through metaphysics, in a way, being grants a world, but it's not a permanent world, but only a temporary world, temporarily sustaining or shielding a structure of intelligibility from the sands of time, I think he says. So metaphysics is not this evil thing also. I mean, it's simply not, its solutions are simply not final, or it's not the end authority on that. That's the main thing. In any case, so the favor of being is the giving of a ground for a world, which simultaneously is also the withdrawing and concealing of otherwise possibilities of grounding. So yeah, so I think I should maybe stop there, because I've been saying a lot of things, and okay, maybe I'll say one more thing in the mysticism thing. So in his 1927 lecture course entitled "The Basic Problems of Phenomenology," Heidegger, in a way that Susanne is distinguishing, right, between her main distinction is also calculative thinking and meditative thinking, but all these go together. So that distinction, and also this distinction of a very subjectivistic approach and appropriation of the divinities, as opposed to being claimed by them. So just as there is this distinction, in the 27 lecture course, Basic Problems of Phenomenology, Heidegger distinguishes between mysticism as well. So he distinguishes between mysticism in the bad sense and mysticism in the eminent sense, right? So mysticism in the eminent sense for Heidegger is exemplified by Meister Eckhart, whom he mentions there, who conceives of the Godhead as a hyper-essential essence, according to Heidegger, which the term he's using here is hyperousia, which links sort of Eckhart back to the tradition of mysticism started by Dionysius, the pseudo-Areopagite, who's sort of the father of fathers of the mystical and the apophatic tradition, which is then carried over by John Scotus Erugena and on to Meister Eckhart. So in this conception, the Godhead is conceived in the fully inexhaustible sense that Susanne discussed. Furthermore, another interesting connection, in the Latour seminars of Heidegger, which much later in his career, Heidegger refers again to Eckhart's understanding of being. And here he does a very interesting reversal between Eckhart and Aquinas, because sophisticated theologians, or let's say the theologians like Aquinas, also were aware of the connection between being and God. But what Heidegger is pointing to is this, that while to Aquinas God is being itself, Deus est ipsum esse, in the Eckhartian counterblow, as he calls it, the counterblow of Eckhart. So for Aquinas, it is God is being, and for Eckhart, it is being is God, esse est Deus, which means that being, he says, istet, being is in a way, or lets God be God. So that's the thing. And finally, before I go to the questions, one of the things that's important in my sort of thinking about the mystics is that although their Godhead is infinite, they're very, very clear on bringing to our attention the importance of finitude. In a way, that's a very paradoxical thing that's happening in mysticism, that given this sort of infinite inexhaustibility of being, or of the Godhead, which actually leads to a focus on finitude, on the facetiousness of the way that being presents itself, or the way that we could conceptualize being. So I think the mystic is heavily interested in finitude in that way. So just to end, the mystic, in my understanding, is focused on the finite, on the finitude of every understanding, even though paradoxically the mystic's being is fundamentally inexhaustible. This means that beyond every conceptualization of the truth, something Susanne wonderfully detailed so well for us, this means that beyond every conceptualization of the truth, there is the possibility of further seeking for the truth. Or as Ibn Arabi says, every belief is a knot on the truth, which does capture the truth to some extent, but does not exhaust the truth. Okay, so that's my sort of presentation. I just wanted to ask Susanne a question or two. So the first question I have is, how do you think that your work on ecology would be like enriched by all these things that we've been discussing about and we've just presented on? So how do you think that your ecological work relates to this? That's my first question.
I think it relates quite powerfully. What comes to mind immediately, various works from deep ecology, as well as some ecofeminist work, and the way in which nature, physis, is sort of apprehended, approached, or understood in a way we could describe as mystical. Granted, depending on the approach, how much the science is being emphasized, there still is room. I want to say it's Paul Taylor, but sometimes I confuse a couple of essays. And so it might be Paul Taylor, it might be Warwick Fox. But there's emphasis made there on the role of intuition. And again, intuition understood as that for which no argument is to be had because it's foundational. And how, say eco-destruction, devastation in one manner we can understand as being the result of human beings who, are in control of decisions, who lack the fundamental intuition about nature. And, then we can pull in Roger Walsh or whoever about how we can indeed augment our perception, which in turn alters our intuitions. So that's why people, students will be like, why, if intuitions are foundational, why do we not all share the same intuition? And of course, that's where phenomenology, augmenting perception, and I would, again, emphasize meditative thinking and meditation, as Heidegger talks about it. I came across another quote, I think it was just last night or this morning, in the Black Notebooks 12 through 15, I think, about meditation. And it was quite powerful because he pointed out, I'll just read it really quick. I think I have it right here. He says, here it is, come to meditation. These words must be uttered at the right moment and not as a summons or a plan, but as an already carried out leap in advance that is now to be recovered. And then he talks about what he calls the basic error, this idea that people try to create some kind of life space through building of spaces. I immediately thought of like yoga studios or something. And how that they might even term this meditation. And he says, but what this is ignorance, to which the essence of meditation is completely denied. And so again, I think what we're trying to do, what we're looking at, and the even broader things, such as all of Thomson's ideas that we've discussed, etc., are all very relevant to ecological studies, issues, whatever we want to term it. And again, my view for quite some time has been, in the end, Heidegger was a nature mystic. I just think that's what he was, and he also often became a poet. He took on that burden, as he calls it, when he's trying to communicate things. Again, that great quote I just love from What Is Called Thinking about the only real thinking is when you speak for a subject.
Yeah.
And I think that's why Heidegger can be difficult to understand, is because I don't really read him and see that he becomes an opponent all that often. More often than not, he's putting forth what we could think of as speaking for something, approaching it in that way. And so, yeah, I hope that
Yes, absolutely. No. I was also, another, this would be rather obvious, of course. The answer could be, of course. But so ontological pluralism would also translate to a pluralistic way of conceiving nature itself. Like, would that also be?
Right. Yeah, I think so. And again, this is where I would immediately, my brain wants to go to building, dwelling, thinking. And for example, how, there Heidegger makes it very clear that building and cultivation and those things are part of dwelling, but only when calculative thinking is being directed by meditative thinking in service to dwelling can the building and the cultivation that we carry out be what's proper to us as, being of the earth. And so nature understood, obviously, especially in the sense of physis, as just another sort of, I always hate to pick a word here, but name or manifestation of being itself, right? But at the same time, obviously, we are dependent upon nature, all of us, even if we don't want to acknowledge that we are as humans. We're completely reliant and dependent upon it for our existence. And so we do have to have some understanding of it, that's epistemological, scientific, and all of that. And then we can put it to use. Just think about animals and people that argue about, whether I should eat meat or not. And, my own view has kind of always been that I think our very existence dictate a lot of that. Inuits, for example, they're not growing vegetables. Okay.
So there's a finitude there too, which we should be humble enough to understand, that we can't be absolutely moral. These are tough negotiations because we are finite beings.
But the willingness to do the negotiation, right, which is, I think, one thing Thomson emphasizes in that essay we were talking about. While there's this, strong tolerance, he wants to, really emphasize that, there's not a singular view in any of these things that are co-political, and it's only when we can acknowledge that, and I do really think when we understand onto-theology is when we're actually just immediately led beyond it. We can come to be more open to let's examine all the various perspectives on whatever we're talking about, the finitude, and then against whatever.
I also sometimes feel that onto-theology is not that. I don't know why it's not. It's not understood in its full scope sometimes, I think, and therefore, it becomes a
great question.
Thomson's work is I think the only full engagement with it, I think. So if that's what you need in order to cross beyond, I mean, if you have to understand that, then a lot of our effort in Heidegger will have to then be focused on onto-theology, though it's a quote unquote bad thing for him, perhaps, but then that becomes therefore important. Okay, so thank you so much, thank you, and I think I have a few more questions, but I think we could discuss that in further conversations. I just like people to, if anyone who wants to ask a question or have comments on the presentation and the idea are welcome to do so.
Thank you very much to both of you, and very stimulating discussion and conversation. I have many questions, but maybe just focus on maybe trying to connect a number of things that you brought up. Ontological pluralism and the limitation of the real, and then devotional polytheism. I wonder whether what you discover with Heidegger here is that the totality of being, and even that is maybe a misconception of it. Heidegger refers to it as being itself only appears to be limited as a limitation of the real, as you said, to the ones, that means us, humans, trying to understand it or to relate to it. So it is our attempt to relate to being itself as the real, or that makes it, may subject it to our violation of it. Maybe that is the limitation of the real, that language always falls short of grasping it. So even what I have just said, so the real, what is real? So that already is filled with metaphysical conceptions, and therefore we have to allow language to try to speak the unspeakable. And in both of your presentations, I was reminded whether this is a revisitation of Parmenides' ontology, who says that being is only one, and everything, and only there is being, and our speaking of it gives evidence of it, okay, but only in violations of it, okay. So, but as we do it, maybe most properly, our words and our language and our languages indicate the truth of being, whatever that is, but we cannot capture it in a concept. So I think you, but you had, I think, yeah, a quote by the Sufist poet. Is he a poet? Ibn Arabi. What time frame is he? Is he our time or
13th century?
13th century.
13th century, actually, Spanish Arab Sufi.
So so apparently he, in translation, he speaks of the one entity. So entity is probably a misconception. Oneness, but also not exclusive. That's why I find Heidegger's reference to the unable being itself. Okay, not in the singular number itself, but reveres itself in the plural number in terms of beings, in terms of the being of beings, and there the dwelling that Susanne spoke about is probably a way to restore, as you say, the divinities. And my question, Susanne, is when we restore, escape the enframing and contain it, and maybe put it in its limits, okay, since we can't stop it, whether in our restoration of the gods who have escaped, we become gods ourselves, divinities, whether this actually is the way to go, that we recognize ourselves as divinities embedded in divine mystery of the fourfold, and then become, in doing so, ourselves, divinities, whatever divinity here may mean. Okay, but the sacred, so just that we are near to the holy. Okay, thank you.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thanks. Bharatwaj may have something to add, but I just a quick response to your last point there, Joachim. Yeah, I mean, I do think so. As far as, I mean, I just hesitate to say, if I can escape in framing and come to dwell, I'm a god. It's just, but at the same time, there is something to what you're saying, and it's definitely worth exploring and considering viewpoints on and how we can understand that. Certainly, I know I kept thinking of Nietzsche's idea about what is it? He says that gods aren't looking for herd members and followers, but co-conspirators, co-creators. Right, and this idea of writing new values on new tablets, and so in that regard, yes, I mean, it may well be that this is something I'm currently contemplating or not sure about, but it may well be that the last God that Heidegger speaks of is, in fact, best understood as something like the embrace, the large-scale embrace, or at least large enough by, I guess, those hidden single ones that he talks about, the future ones, the forerunners of the future ones, of this idea that of ontological pluralism. And in doing that, as you just mentioned, we become divine ourselves. I guess I prefer that a lot better than saying I become a god. The divinization of the human being, which, interesting enough, is part of Eastern Orthodoxy, which is really the only kind of Christianity that, in my view, the later Heidegger has any real respect for. And we could go on and on about that. But so, yeah, I mean, again, anything we come up with, I feel like articulations, and no matter how beautiful and wonderful and precise and concise we feel they may be, we always need to have that qualification there that it's still limited. It's still a limited view. And there might be ways in which, we need to expand it or broaden it or bring in something else. But yeah, and I mean, we're all going to die. And, I'm certainly, Iain's comment about his hair migrating south, it's very funny and it's very apt. And I'm sure we all have our respective things, except those that are quite young, like Bharatwaj is probably my daughter's age. But, if we're paying attention, we know we're mortal. We know we are marching inevitably towards our death. But at the same time, from a spiritual perspective, and I'm using that in Heidegger's sense of the term, we may also be feeling sort of an expansiveness that's growing, and something is definitely different. And so, yeah, that very well could simply be we are becoming divine in a certain sense. Bharatwaj, did you want to say more?
Yeah, about the paradox that Joachim brought up. I mean, I'm reading this book by Dennis Turner called The Darkness of God, which is on epiphatic theology. And in the second chapter, I think he talks about, he's talking about Dionysus and that tradition. And one of the things that he suggests is that, of course, the ultimate, the Godhead, let's say, cannot be articulated or put into words, but then we still have to go ahead and use words nevertheless and keep failing in the use of words. And it's only this failing to properly articulate and conceptualize the ultimate that we even realize the finitude of. I mean, that's how the Christian mystical tradition definitely dealt with that paradox. In the Sufi tradition, Ibn Arabi is very careful of too much transcendence language, because he thinks that that's a concealed form of immanence, because he thinks that too much transcendence is actually you just end up with a sort of conceptual idea of God, which is not really transcendent at all. It's just the product of your mind. So he will often break his rules. He will often suddenly call God a person, or suddenly give certain attributes to God, and but then in his in the overall picture that he's drawing of God, God is definitely like more than the one entity that he is mentioning. He is much beyond that. In fact, with the tradition of Ibn Arabi and his followers, transcendence in a way bends into immanence. So it's a very transimmanent tradition, that God is so transcendent that the only way that God can be known is through certain immanent structures of understanding and so on and so forth. So I don't know if that answered the question, but that's what I had in mind about the one entity point that he mentions.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just maybe a comment on the side, and then with a question, maybe a little provocative. So the Catholic tradition actually can help us to understand what it would mean to become a god or a divinity, since they have saints. And when Mahatma Gandhi was killed, people would refer to him as someone who treaded to earth like no one else. As a saint, same things are said about Socrates when he was killed. And so there are exceptional human beings, known and unknown to us, who have become saints. And here maybe the Catholic tradition can help us. So one question, because language basically is at its limits when we try to speak about the divine divinity or the Godhead or whatever. So Susanne, I assume when you speak about the gods who have escaped and we can restore them, you have the immanent gods, the gods as in their immanence in mind, immanence, not transcendent. And so Ilya, you speak about the divine, basically saying that since the divine is ungraspable, there must be some kind of transcendence attached to it. And because of that, how can you put, and that's my provocative question, and I will end with that. How can you protect yourself, maybe with the authors that you read, that in your mind anything goes whenever we talk about the divine?
Okay. I think I understood that. I wanted to make sure I understood what you were asking.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so how can we protect ourselves if anything goes?
I guess in your mind anything goes. Anything can be said about the God and cannot be wrong, because God is not just one thing.
Oh, okay, sure. On the one hand, I would say, well, that kind of question is worth considering and exploring. And, we could do that like over hours and really kind of give hardcore examples and make sure we're all understanding what we mean by that. At the same time, my response is there's a way in which the positing of such questions, could be sort of a genuine, sincere seeking, but it could also be taking on the role of an opponent, because for example, with the strong tolerance thing in the ontological pluralism, I mean, my own thought as I'm writing up stuff, reading that essay and talking, and is over and over like, oh, what about those people who are going to say, what are you saying? We should tolerate the pedophiles. I mean, we all know, I think, this kind of thing. And again, I guess, my response to you, taking the question as posed sincerely, is that a person who, in my understanding, a person who, has understood onto-theological, thus embraced ontological pluralism, and is engaged in, or engaged by, rather had by, because that's how I see it, the Gelassenheit, the releasement, and has the openness, that being itself, the being that flows into the being and exudes, is love. It's love. And so I don't know. I mean, I don't know how to, we could go on and on with that, but to me, that in and of itself means that there's a whole range of possibilities, so to speak, that become closed off for that individual. So I don't know if that's really answering your question, unless you have something else in mind, like this idea that there might be some gods or divinities that are malevolent or something. But if you want to clarify,
Or
Go ahead.
can I just add something to? I mean, one way in which it's an important question as well. But one way that I would try to think about it would be to go back to the notion of finitude, and also to the devotional part of devotional polytheism. So I'm an Indian. I can only think. I'm finite, so I have a certain situation in the world. So I'm not. I To some extent, yes, anything goes, but only to some extent. I mean, I have a finite way in which I can comport myself to the world, and that will be there will be a limitation to that. But then, if I'm talking to a German, my pluralism would be not to become like that, or to become him or her, because I can't, because I'm finite. But my pluralism would be to be sensitive to other possibilities as possibilities. So I need not embody all those possibilities. So I may be it's like, if I'm a Hindu, I have a certain way in which I think about the world. But then if I'm talking to a Christian, given my finitude, my task would be to be sensitive enough in my devotion to the path that I'm already in, and sensitive enough that I know that there are other possibilities. So only to that extent could that go. It couldn't be anything go in that sense, in my opinion, given the finitude part. So that would be my attempt at answering that really, really tough question. But
I guess you would reject any kind of fundamentalism.
which is what, yeah, Susanne
Right.
was. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Good, thank you.
I always love listening to Susanne and Bharatwaj. It's great to hear you again, and it's fascinating for me to see how far you have taken little ideas from my work and gone on your own. So it's wonderful, and it's great and very original, and I love it. So that's mainly what I want to say. And thank you to Alfred for, as always, organizing and composing this, creating this space for many different lovers of thinking to think together. You think about, I mean, I'm always struck by the weirdness of online existence, and like all these little faces, and then like the faces that aren't showing, So if you think of being as a multifaceted gem, there's all these facets we can see, all these little being here's, and then there's the being here's that we can't see, like the far side of the gem. So we have a nice little analogy for the multiplicity of being in this very technological format, which is interesting. And I am, when I think about the inexhaustibility of being, for me, it's really important that that's not the ineffability of being. I often describe what I call like a Levinasian misreading of Heidegger, where being gets treated as ineffable. Like Bharatwaj, you quoted that line where I say something about being finally unnameable or finally unknowable, finally unknowable. And by that, I don't mean it can't be known. There's something about it that escapes all knowing.
Yeah.
But rather that it can never be finally known. Like there's no one. Yeah. So I realized as you said that my own phrase is kind of ambiguous in a way that might lend itself toward one thing, saying being is this kind of ineffable withdrawal that we never can encounter. Whereas Heidegger is very critical of that, because phenomenologically, how could you encounter what you can never encounter? So yeah, we could talk about this stuff all day. I too loved witch kitsch. Very nice phrase for real phenomenon. Let me ask, because this is picking up on the last thing that Joachim was pushing you on, that I'm genuinely tormented about myself, and I love Susanne's answer to this. So maybe Bharatwaj, see what you think too. But you quoted your mystic there, who I love just learning about from you, saying, my love can take on any form. And then one of the forms was a temple for idols. So that's interesting, right? So Suzanne's answer to are you saying strong tolerance is tolerant of everything except intolerance? So it rejects all fundamentalisms that claim to have the one right answer, when the idiot in chief says there's only two genders and they're constituted conception, A, that's biologically incoherent. There's only one sex at conception, so he just turned us all into women. Right? The Y chromosome comes in later. So, but when idiots claim that they have access to some divine truth that lets them rule out huge swaths of actual existing Dasein, that's just a pretty clear reaction formation against the multiplicity of being that's making them too anxious, and they haven't learned to be, in your nice terminology, Susanne, vulnerable to this overwhelming possibilities, even if they're not personally interested in pursuing them. They can't let them be. But as you said, there is the question of the pederast, or the person who's actually doing, the murderer. There's things that we seemingly don't want to tolerate because they're themselves intolerant. And the temple full of idols, if an idol, I hear idol in a kind of Levinasian way as someone who's reduced God to like a golden calf. So they've turned being into a particular framework, the technologizer. And what's it mean to love them? Does it mean to love them like love the sinner, hate the sin? Or does it mean to, something stronger than that?
Should I go with the answer? Yeah, I think he is. I think he is there in a way subverting the religious sort of orthodox demand to not have idols, and I think, one way to think about this is, in a way, the question of the pederast is a bit easier. I think I feel because that person is harmful, and his presence would actually lead to a reduction of plural possibilities because of the toxicity and the harm and the violence that they would bring in. But the question of the idols, I sometimes think, would be the question of mistakes or a wrong way of approaching a being, which is fine to the extent that that's where you have reached, or that's the approach that you are taking. So far as that's the path you're on, okay. It's fine. But that, I think, it could go back to the love the sinner, hate the sin kind of deal. Yeah. So, and also this leads to a problem. Now that you were asking the question, I just thought that it could lead to the problem of Heidegger's statement about the idols. Now, what do you do with that? That's a question. I don't know, but yeah, because to him, definitely, idolatry in that sense could be the very thing that devotional polytheism is saying we shouldn't be doing. Have to think more.
Yeah, there's the second version of that paper you're referring to is now, I think, chapter 7 in my death book. And I talk a lot there about, I developed the critique of the thanatological impulse behind the desire for righteous purity, and how that desire to be 100% right and your opponent 100% wrong, fully expressed, is a kind of death worship.
Right. Would it help to replace the word idol with icon, maybe? So, for example, if we go to a Buddhist temple, there's definitely an idol of the Buddha, but that's that could be seen as a symbol, like a cross, or an icon, which gives a facet of the Buddha nature, let's say, or so on. So maybe that could help, perhaps. So that's just a thought that came to me.
Your mystic, sorry, I'm bad with names, but Ibn, what is it?
Ibn Arabi.
Ibn Arabi. So when Ibn Arabi speaks about the real or being as a person, for example, or a particular thing, I like that, because although it risks the kind of idolatry of reducing the infinite to a finite form, you need some finite form.
It goes back to your point about not ineffability versus, I think it somewhere is connected. Sorry.
mean, there's a kind of, I feel like there's a risk of idolatry in Heidegger, and it's in his celebration of like the highest artistic achievements. Like when he talks about Bertolin or Michelangelo, there's this sense of when Michelangelo brings David from the marble, I want to say he brought out one powerfully meaningful sense of possibilities in that stone, and in so doing has come into his own as a world-disclosing sculptor and brought being into its own as something that lends itself to all these multiple possibilities. But if you say, no, he's perfectly expressed being, that stone is perfectly embodied as David, and there's no possibilities left out or negated. That's a kind of idolatry.
That's a good point. Yeah.
In response, if I could say something in response to what you just said, Iain. So I believe I understood what you were getting at, and I'll just say it in another way, which I think is absolutely right and a great way to go with this. So you've got that piece of marble, and then, what's going to happen between it and the particular sculptor. And it's not the case that marble contained only David. Rather, it's possible it could have contained something else for that particular sculptor. But absolutely, I think it could have contained something just as perfect, if you will, for a different sculptor, right? So that the possibilities within the marble are not limited to a single one, but there's something about the interplay between the particular artist, that piece of marble, and who knows, maybe if that piece of marble had been presented 2 years later, it still would have been different yet, right? And so I thought that might have been what you were getting at there, that we don't want to try to, again, because then we're reducing things to a single thing again, right?
Fundamentalists saying, God told me you cannot be transgender. That's like imagining that the ultimate reality is dictating a very particular form and only that form. And that's a phenomenal fusion.
Scarily, it has taken it has become a political reality as well, sadly.
Real problem. That's why you can't just sort of say, well, I'm interested in ontology and not politics.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
But that kind of Christian fundamentalism already is idolatry, since it confines God to some certain definite conception, which I think you, have warned against.
Okay, well, thank you again, Susanne and Bharatwaj.
Thank you.
We're going to close it for this evening. Tomorrow we'll continue at 3 o'clock my time.
Okay.
And thank you, everybody, for being there. And I hope to see at least some of you tomorrow. And we'll have 5 more presentations. So in the meantime, take care. Have a nice evening, afternoon, whatever is applicable.
Thank you.
And see you soon.